How should Scotland react to what's happening at the moment in the international battles between Ukraine and the White House? I'm sure a lot of people would think Scotland is too small and too much of a regional power to be of any significance in what's happening at the moment. And yet it matters for democracy how we respond, and that two people who are not terribly popular in Scotland, and that is Prince Charles and Donald Trump, will have a meeting in Scotland, very likely, with this country as a backdrop, yet again, part of a tradition that many of us want to escape. And we have a say. We must have a say, because otherwise you don't need to be occupied by a country to have your mindset, your outlook and your horizons politically completely dominated by a might is right philosophy. So Pat and I ponder all of that, the recent goings on, and by the time you hear this, there will doubtless have been more in the battle for Europe, for democracy and for Ukraine. It's that big a thing. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Hi, Joms, and welcome to this week's Lesley podcast. Whew, yes, and yeah, it's my head is literally, as we spoke about before we started recording. It's virtually exploding. And you came up with a rather nifty analogy, I thought, for the whole process that we're currently going through.
Aye. Well, it struck me that, thinking about trying to dive into the middle of this podcast was a bit like standing, on that school day when you all went to the swimming pool and there was a queue for all those bold enough to dive off the high board and you thought you could do it. And then you stand at the front, look at the water and think, oh, my God. But I mean, the thing is, there's the certainty is that whatever we say now will probably be completely out of date within about 2 hours even, But still, let's try.
Yes, well, I mean, as I said, I was desperate for you to include that analogy because you talk about the swimming pool. And I think the only way I can try and get my head around it is try and operate kind of chronologically, from all that happened. And I think the place to begin possibly is Starmer's visit after Macron to see President Trump. And I know that seems like not just days away, but absolutely eons away now in the whole development that's taken place in the political situation concerning Ukraine, where Starmer, I mean, what a sook. And then we'll think about it later. What did it actually achieve?
Well, weird. I've got to say, I was actually in hospital that day for a wee thing, which is totally fine, but it just sort of, I didn't see it all happening as it happened kind of thing. So just on looking at it afterwards, as I think nearly everybody has said it, I mean, we are really, we're revisiting stuff heavily for a wee while. But it was, especially the bit with the letter being produced, from sort of, from Chaza to kind of use Scotland as a backdrop, as Scotland often is now. And just, to me, there's many things that are nauseating about this. But the idea that Starmer and King Charles can basically just decide which of the many sort of estates in Scotland would be the best place to butter up Trump, who the Scottish public in any measure of, response are probably pretty opposed to. And just while we're at it, you remember that poll that suggested an independent Scotland that was a republic, as in not with King Charles at the top, was, a 59%, I think it was more than that actually, supported by the Scottish public. So it's kind of the idea, it's almost like a tiny mini-me version of the everything being done over your heads sort of theme or style that is currently being piloted and pushed by Donald Trump. So, it doesn't matter what any of us think, we're going to get this guy inflicted on us. And I've got to say, maybe we're, going off too quickly into the Scottish bit, but, people that I've spoken to have said, well, now that there's been such anger generated by Trump's behavior towards Zelensky and to Ukraine, the option of going to Dumfries House, which is near Cumnock in Ayrshire, a pretty strong sort of, with everything that comes with the Ayrshire kind of political past, which is pretty solid at one time union organisation and working class left organisation. I can imagine a fair old demonstration managing to get itself worked up there. So perhaps it will suit them better to try and wheak him up to Balmoral if
Hmm.
indeed this all goes on. Although, I mean, although there's a deuceness about D-side, I'm pretty sure there would be a bit of mobilisation for that too. But still, we're jumping ahead of ourselves here. I thought it was toe curling, and then you see everybody else kind of in. With the idea that Zelensky came in and just by not wearing a suit, so annoyed Donald Trump that he kind of, the mist descended and everything that's happened. It's for some people, it looks like in hindsight, Keir Starmer managed to creep around without waking up the giant. I keep
Yes.
seeing these analogies. It's as if I've taken mushrooms, which I haven't. But it's like that bit, in any of these kind of, pantomime tales where you're just trying to kind of not disturb the giant. And so, okay, he didn't seem to wake up too much on Keir Starmer's watch, well done. And there's been widespread support for his ideas about trying to rally the Europeans to kind of accept that the Americans are fundamentally AWOL, although that's not how he's saying it, because he's still doing his fence balancing bit, which I guess somebody has to do until, the fence breaks. But still, I mean, the sight of him groveling and that letter is just impressed in my head now. What did you think?
Oh yeah, it's exactly what I thought, Lesley. I mean, I did one of my usual puns when I referred to a psycho fancy, spelling as in psychopath, and that's what he was creeping around trying to do. And the same thing came through with Peter Mandelson, the ambassador to the United States of America, who completely retracted, says, "Oh, I didn't believe all these things I said before about President Trump. I retract all these completely now." Sook. And it's this whole basis of attempting to maintain this so-called special relationship, which I keep thinking to myself, what is the so-called special relationship? The closest of allies. To be perfectly frank, if you look at the closest of allies of the United States of America, it's Israel. And we see this continuous drift towards Putin from Trump, and the turning the back on Europe that we spoke about before. And the whole thing about it was an ambush, Kenny Badenoch, by the way. It was a definite ambush on Zelensky, because the whole way that this is organized, this so-called pool spray of the White House correspondence, originally White House correspondence, and where the president comes out with someone who's been there. Usually it's a photo opportunity where there'll be some softball questions and shaking of hands, and it will be an opportunity for the president to gain publicity. And Trump has previous on this, back in, I think it was 2017, he banned, I think, CBS reporters there for he said, asking rude questions. And what's happened now is that the White House has taken control of the correspondents who can actually attend. They've removed the control of who attends from the White House Correspondents Association, and they're starting to pack it full of right and far right alternative media outlets. And we go back to when Trump actually greeted Zelensky when he got out of the SUV. He commented on how he was dressed. The question that was then asked was that this guy, Brian Glenn, who works for Real America's Voice, a right and far right conspiracy-laden US digital and online and satellite channel, that came to prominence because in 2019, when Steve Bannon was banned by everybody else, they took him on board. He now has 8 million viewers through this channel. And he's the boyfriend of, wait for it, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman, who is a far-right conspiracy theorist as well, a MAGA loyalist. And Brian Glenn underarmed the first question to Trump, saying, what would you think your legacy as a peacemaker will be? And Trump says, well, that's what I want it to be. And he said, thank you, Brian, for that question. It was a nice question. What's your second question? Bang. And that's where he came in with the suit. And there was a wink between Trump and Glenn. This was a fit up. And I don't know how you felt about it. It was like watching one of the worst things I've seen at work, where you get the sidekick, the manager comes in, you've got the head of department, the manager comes in and starts pummeling away and initiates the first set of blows. And it's the wee lad who's the bully's best mate in the playground as well. It was a fit up. It was designed to get under Zelensky's skin and to undermine him. And there's a whole history as well, as people may remember, that Trump despises Zelensky because of that phone call back in 2019, where he tried to put pressure on Zelensky to investigate the conspiracy theory concerning Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, and withheld congressionally mandated $400 million worth of aid to the Ukraine on the basis of this. And the House Intelligence Committee found at that point that Trump had solicited aid from a foreign government to benefit his re-election campaign. Now, he was impeached, and Senate didn't go along with the impeachment. It was overturned. And he has maintained that personal animus towards Zelensky since then. So you've got a twin attack there. The twin attack is he wants the rare earth metals. He's sucking up to Putin for whatever reason or other. And it's personal animus and revenge, which is a best echoed for President Donald Trump.
Yeah. And yeah. Well, there's so many people that you can listen to on this that are, I mean, the insights are really profound. But, one thing was that in his campaign, he did say he would get the Ukraine-Russian situation sorted in a day or something like that.
Yeah.
And so for him, I'd imagine he needs this to be settled fast, because that's what he said he could do. It was the same with the Gaza. It's got the details are all details. The objective, I'd imagine, is to sound like the guy he was that got elected, who is somebody who just walks in and makes things happen quickly. So somebody kind of, in his eyes, footering about with the reality of their democracy is just getting in the way of him getting this thing done hyper fast. And it is, I mean, obviously, utterly crazy. Jen Stout, redoubtable woman of this parish, or at least, the Northern Isles, was on Radio 5 Live for a very good long section. I don't listen copiously to Radio Scotland, but if anyone's listening, there's a thought. And she was pointing out just really nuts and bolts stuff about the idea of Ukraine accepting, as a sort of deal that brokered by everybody else, which is that, Russia has never resiled from its view that many of there's 4 oblasts, which are big kind of territories, that Russia has believed are part of Russian territory. And it wants all of those 4 to be part of Russia. That's its view. They include Kherson and Zaporizhia. And as she pointed out, neither of the capital of those 2 oblasts is currently occupied by the Russians. So what that would mean is handing over land that the Russians haven't managed to gain, simply to sort of fit in with Trump's desire to just get this thing done quickly. And of course, everyone said it's perfectly true. The kind of talking about any kind of human rights issues in Europe or Ukraine or anything, it just beggars belief when you think about what happened to Alexei Navalny, who was poisoned twice and died in a gulag last year. All the rough treatment. I mean, again, Jen made this point really well when she was talking about the end of the Afghanistan occupation by Russia many years ago, and pointed out that was actually done by a mother's group in Russia who got together because so many of their sons were dying, as they saw, pointlessly in Afghanistan. And it was pressure from them in civic society that brought that finally to an end. And Jen was saying, there's no civic society practically in Russia now. There's no chance to put your head over the parapet, because you see what happens to people who challenge in any way at all. So that kind of internal motor, I mean, dear knows many things have happened in given time and enough pressure and enough pain. But, where we are at the moment is not analogous to Afghanistan. On the other hand, Ukraine is a pretty thriving large country that is producing quite a lot of its own. It's the biggest world producer of the smallest types of drones at the moment. So it's not like it's sitting, as Afghanistan was, just without its own resources and just waiting for one of the superpowers to decide who wants it. But I mean, it's so many different things than that. But that thing about the bloody suit reminded me so much of the Michael Foot in his donkey jacket. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Where because nobody was going to take him on, particularly about his left-wing views of how Britain could be changed, they just went for his appearance. And we ended up forever talking about whether wearing a donkey suit at the cenotaph was some kind of disrespectful thing. And so, that it struck me so much that this was some of the same stuff. As you say, a total setup job from start to finish to just, do the almost unthinkable with Zelensky, leave him like some sort of pariah, and put the challenge back onto Europe. Okay, you've said that he's your guy. If you want to curry up to him, it's going to come with a pretty major price tag. Are you willing to do it? And the bit we're in now is, what does that mean? And is Europe willing to do it?
Yeah, because I mean, what it did is I couldn't believe the US presence, military presence in Europe. Let's exclude the hundreds of billions. It's $106 billion, the latest figure so far that the US has given to Ukraine, 70 billion in military spending. Now, the funny thing about it, of course, is I think there are 70 comes into this as well. I think there's 70 cities where the manufacturing in the US is taking place to provide that 70 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine. So in pausing that aid, what Trump is actually doing is paradoxically cutting off the work that's being carried out in American cities by American workers to provide the military aid there. But there are apparently 65,000 US troops in Europe, another 10,000 more on the Polish-Russian border, 8 air squadrons, 4 Navy destroyers, missile defense systems, 6 massive weapons stockpiles with tanks and armored vehicles, and an estimated 100 nuclear weapons. And what Trump said on Sunday was that he was spend less time worrying about Putin and concentrate on stopping the rape gangs, the murderers, etc., entering the US before the US becomes like Europe. And I think that is the clear signal that what Trump is doing, it is an America first perspective. And that whole way that Europe and the UK in particular have tied themselves into US interests, foreign policy interests, and relied entirely upon the United States of America is now becoming problematic. But
it's as problematic as, here we were 2 or 3 years ago, suddenly China being bolted in at the center of systems using their kind of IT systems became problematic. If you'd gone back 5 years earlier, everyone was kind of saying, wow, this is the way forward. And let's embrace this cheaper, more effective technology. But, we just 2 weeks ago or last week or something, we were talking about a couple of things. One is Starlink, which is Elon Musk's system, which bizarrely, I mean, just in one of these, just side glances, I'd noticed is being deployed apparently on the northern line of ScotRail to finally give passengers going up to Wick and Thurso and places like this, some sort of broadband access. And I remember at the time thinking, what? I mean, can we not get our own system? I mean, it's just a satellite system. What is so difficult about getting our own one of that? But this is nothing compared to the Starlink system is what pretty much allows communications to happen on the front lines and so on in Ukraine, so that even when you hear people talking about how much they can be substituted, and that there is a bit of a time lag because some of the weaponry is in Ukrainian hands and won't, the Americans stopping supplies won't immediately affect what they've already got. But the trouble is that with that Starlink system, that is, it's just mind blowing how much Elon Musk has managed to muscle in. Just by the by, before we came on, the second bit of the Radio 5 phone in, it's one of these days where you listen, you think, God, this is actually worth listening to. They'd gone on to, the Royal Society is about to kick Elon Musk out as a sort of, esteemed member or whatever, description they have. He's in there at the moment with Darwin and, kind of just absolute luminaries. But they're having a debate. They had it last night as to whether or not they're going to kick him out. That will probably hurt him very little. But, the rest of the world, you can see that there are articles talking about pushback on people now with Teslas feeling it's kind of, just not a good thing to be owning. Seen some people saying that they're kicking in Amazon because of Jeff Bezos standing behind Trump and all the rest of it. I mean, I've got to think that this does rather feed the liberal kind of thoughts. You would like to think this was happening, and actually it was that similar stuff that let me at least not see how well Trump was doing in the run up to the election. So I'd imagine, coming back to what you're saying, is that nonetheless, weirdly, whilst all of the rest of the world is kind of agog at how Trump has essentially destabilized the whole security of kind of, Western Europe or Asia, Europe, or the whole blooming shooting match, he's looking at inflation and homeland security. So he's addressing Americans tonight in a way that could be a bit of a sort of State of the Nation address. And it looks likely, he'll hardly mention any of this, because this will kind of, whether this really is going to be a biggie. While we're at it, we talked last week as well about where are the Democrats in all of this. And it seems that the rebuttal is being made by someone who might be someone to watch here. It's Elisa Slotkin, unusual names both there, who she's a former CIA agent. She worked as a Middle East analyst. She served 3 tours in Iraq. She worked at the White House, Pentagon for Bush and Obama. She won a seat in the House of Representatives in 2018. Particularly important, though, she won in November in Michigan as a senator. The state went to Trump, but she actually managed to oust the Republican nominee for the Senate seat, even though he'd served 7 terms. So she seems to have a bit of something about her. And yet, when you look online to see what she's talking about at the moment, not a dicky bird about Ukraine or arms spending or any of that. It's all about tariffs and inflation and whether or not, that migrants are being dealt with properly. So it's kind of like a completely two-tone world here, where if many speculate now that the problem for Trump will be that the tariffs business that he pushed today as well will be the one that does for him, because so much of what ordinary Americans see comes from other countries. I mean, there's a brilliant, we'll put the wee link in, but there's a very good BBC article that looks at the products that come in from Mexico, China and Canada, which are the ones that have all had roughly, I think, 25% tariffs or whatever suddenly today. So, for example, 78% of trucks in the United States come from Mexico. Who knew? Just while we're at it, 53% of insulated wire. But electric batteries, 56% come from China. And then you just come down to more ordinary things, tomatoes, lots of goods like that. This article is also pointing out that the inflation in their index rose 3% in January, marking a 6-month high. And a new poll by CBS says 62% of Americans say prices are going up in the past few weeks. Now, this might be a little bit like Al Capone getting done for his tax evasion, but, the economy, stupid, will be the one. And whilst there's normally a sort of up to 6-month honeymoon while people are waiting to see if the sugarling around makes any difference to them, it's weird how the price of eggs literally is the thing that was mentioned, right in the back of Kamala Harris losing. Well, the price of eggs are still going up. So, there's an awful lot of kind of stuff in motion at the moment in the domestic economy of the States, never mind the kind of horror he's inflicting everywhere else.
Yeah, because, I mean, this is the world that we live in, where there's going to be, and I think the next week, there's a worldwide 25% tariff he's going to put on aluminium and steel. 2nd of April, we don't know what it'll be yet and which agricultural products it was going to be on, but there's a worldwide tariff's going to be on agricultural products and 25% on car imports. And the thing about that is that the American people will pretty soon understand that these tariffs are going to mean that the prices for these things are ramped up. And I'll just be intrigued to see how the US economy can turn itself around so quickly, if at all possible, to actually replace the imported goods to boost employment in the United States of America. I mean, it can't be done overnight. I mean, obviously, but I'll be intrigued to see what happens there. The other thing as well is, I don't know if you saw the governor of Ontario was turning around and saying that because of all the electricity imports particularly from Canada, he with a smile on his face, he'd cut off energy to the United States of America. I mean, and it's worth $2 billion in terms of trade to Canada, 6 million US homes, and they get 99% of the natural gas from Canada. So they're he's picking fights with people on these tariffs one. And I think you're probably right. In terms of foreign policy, if you can turn around and say, look, we're leaking money. I mean, it's an enormous amount of money, 106 billion, I think, over the last year. We were sending to the Ukraine for both military and other financial aid. And even though some of its vast majority is spent here, we're not going to send that money. We're going to spend it on our own folk. But then you get that whole thing, as you say, of inflation and the potential of all these imports costing 25% more, because I can assure you it will be passed on to the consumer. People are not going to take their profits down from it. But you said about the European reaction to the cutting off of military aid to Ukraine and the reaction to what Trump's been saying. I don't know if you saw Ursula von der Leyen come up with a 3-point plan. That the EU countries can increase their defence spending without triggering restrictions on budget deficits. There's going to be 150 billion worth of euros in loans for overall EU defences. And this sounds very, very familiar, folks. If you've been watching, we're not going to be spending any money on aid here. We're going to transfer it to defence spending. Allow redirection of social funding for levelling up in the EU to defence spending. And what's happening is, and I noticed the Estonian foreign minister turning and saying as well that Europe must step up and fill that gap. We are moving into that rearmament phase, which I find very, very worrying. And this is when I'm in a quandary, Lesley. I don't know how you feel. And when about this, because yes, we've got to stand up to Putin, but are we being sucked into this interlinked set of alliances, even though, the US might drop out and not go along with Article 5, I think it is, of the NATO Convention, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. Withdraw the United States of America. We ramp up defense spending. We get into that whole spiral that we've seen before. And when John Swinney turns around and says he'd be quite prepared to see Scottish troops boots on the ground in some kind of security operation in Ukraine, I'm gutted about this, I mean, because yes, we've got to stand up to Putin, but are we in a position now we're on this spiral into inevitable conflict, and the inevitable conflict that, given what is being said, that we will have European boots on the ground and we will have Scottish troops on the front line, possibly, as Jonathan Shafi said in the National, being asked to defend US workers who are extracting and exploiting these rare minerals that the Ukrainians have said today they're quite prepared to reach a deal with the US to allow them to extract. Are we being dragged into this? And that whole shift that took place when the SNP changed its policy on being a member of NATO. It is, I mean, I'm being honest about it. I don't know where I stand on this. I'm extremely worried, though.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, yeah. The problem is that the possibility of, just as you've described it there, being potentially on a front line as peacekeepers without a proper American backup.
Yeah.
But American workers in there, which is taken, as Nigel Farage would suggest from the Commons, as a sort of de facto, look, there's nothing's going to happen when we've got Americans in there, because you touch one of them and we'll just nuke you.
Yeah.
So that feels a very wobbly basis on which to find any sort of peace deal, and there would be a larger issue, I think, than simply what nationality of peacekeepers are in there. That simply wouldn't be acceptable as things stand to Ukraine and probably to Europe. You'd have to say that many countries on the front line that previously had not been in NATO, like Finland particularly, but Sweden as well, and the Norwegians have had a huge commitment of peacekeeping forces to the UN. So it's quite common for countries that have tried to remain neutral to then put their sort of almost equal equivalent person power into UN peacekeeping operations. And that clearly would be different than NATO, since some of those countries weren't in NATO until recently. So the idea of peacekeeping as something that people commit troops to is not a strange one, really. It's more when the UN's doing it, it's done on the basis of UN agreements about where those people are deployed. Although you would have to say they can often be wobbly too, as we know through history. But still, coming back the one that seems to me to be kind of scarier is the suggestion that President Macron has made, is that a nuclear alliance is needed now, because if the Americans are basically going to take their kind of nuclear forces out of the equation. And there's a couple of excellent articles actually by somebody that I hadn't encountered before, writing in The Guardian, Simon Tisdale, and apologies if everyone knows who this is, but he was noticing that last week Trump said he wanted to have US defense spending, especially on nuclear weapons. So Macron had actually said, the French have what is a genuinely independent nuclear deterrent. The Brits one is obviously pretty laced up with the Americans in lots of ways. So whether it can be what it actually amounts to at the moment is very questionable. And in fact, there's been some really excellent articles written asking the mere fact that Keir Starmer is having to talk about increasing defence spending suggests the nuclear deterrent doesn't work. Just right there. So this to me, I mean, that's the one that I cannot kind of just even think about this being a possibility, that we end up trying to disentangle Trident. Well, who's we? Keir Starmer again, back to the backdrop, Scotland, the backdrop. He manages to disentangle this so that it's genuinely something that could be used in Europe to provide a nuclear deterrent to Russia. And yet this is what is being talked about. And, when they even look at the numbers, combining that, if indeed our nuclear deterrent was under our control, that would form a nuclear defense shield, which is apparently twice the size of the weapons that China's got. China now, and just you listen to yourself, and this is so the wrong direction to everything. The National basically sent people out to watch at a conference in New York, which was the non-proliferation treaty agreement. And that is bizarrely, that is kind of gathering pace with more and more countries signing up to it. The latest one was Indonesia. This, from memory, it's 93 countries who were operating in that direction towards the acknowledgement by so many different world powers that the indiscriminate nature of the use of nuclear weapons essentially rules them out as anything that can be used. But that's back in the old world where rules matter and treaties matter. And, what Trump has cast us into now is just a kind of might is right perspective where none of this stuff seems to matter. And just coming back to your man, Simon, in The Guardian, he wrote a tremendous column where he's talking about an ugly, disordered world of raw power, brute force, selfish arrogance, dodgy deals and brazen lies. And says this has been coming for a while. The American president is just its noisy harbinger, but Europe knows it has to supply more and better weapons for Kyiv. And that, coming back to your point again, it feels, creating an economy that's based on weapons manufacture. Wow, if that's what we've come to, that's about as useful as our previous, property owning democracy bubble that's created many of the problems we've got today. But one other thing just to lob in was something we did talk about last week, which is now being talked about, which is the frozen assets that are sitting there. 300 billion. You were talking before about the amounts that Trump is wary of spending in Europe. And just from memory, correct me if I'm wrong, it was something like 106 billion.
Yeah.
Well, 300 billion are sitting in frozen Russian assets. And the EU and those who have decision making over it are still titivating around in that one. And the one that is kind of hit the headlines today in Britain is the money that was basically taken by the British government when Chelsea was sold by your man Abramovich. There was 2.5 billion taken from him at the time. And that money has sat in a kind of British government Home Office account for 3 years. There was a tremendous piece on by the pressure group Redress, who point out that money was confirmed right then when the sale was made. It was supposed to benefit all victims of the war in Ukraine. So it was going only to humanitarian aid, not to weapons sales. But that's 2.5 billion that could have been spent on women that have been raped and tortured, the aftermath of what has happened in many of the areas that were occupied by the Russians and still are. All of that is what that money was intended for, and the Foreign Office has sat on it. At the weekend, Rachel Reeves announced that the interest would be used. I mean, what? This is pretty shameful. And it's, again, if this doesn't get picked up, you begin to think we've just lost the plot. If we've decided that essentially foreign aid doesn't matter, and fair play to Annalisa Dodds for resigning as the appropriate minister, a Scottish lass, it would have to be said. I've met her a couple of times doing various question time and any questions things, and she's a human. I mean, you can talk to her and she's not in the least kind of whiny or difficult simply because you're an independent supporter. So she certainly did the right thing. But here we are with international aid now looking like a lucky bag kind of extra. And then you've got this question of the 2.5 billion that should have come from the Home Office to help humanitarian aid in Ukraine. Will that start to look the same? Humanitarian aid. What's that all about? We've got to get our centre back. It's a bit like political Pilates. We need to get a strong core, because otherwise, it's it's just a complete race to the bottom. We don't even need a Trump in our midst if we start mimicking the kind of, the false ideas, the might is right, all of this stuff. It's like you don't need to be occupied then to have changed your outlooks completely. And that question's still about Elon Musk. All those systems that are looking at Starlink, we've just got to waken up. I mean, in all sorts of respects, this is the end of thinking that you can just have some superpowers kit in and be pretty sure that permanently them at the centre of all your important infrastructure is okay.
Yes, and meanwhile, I don't know if you noticed that the National Wealth Fund that we talked about last week can now be spent on defence. They've changed the rules in the National Wealth Fund, so they can now that money can now be spent on defence spending as well, in terms of attracting private enterprise and private funding for increased defence spending and military aid. Angela Rayner was on Radio 4 this morning, and when she eventually she couldn't give a direct answer about how they felt about the pausing of the aid. She said it was a matter for the USA. She reiterated the Starmer line that the UK and USA were the closest of allies. Well, they're so close that when Starmer was asked before this in the Commons, what about the potential of Trump cutting off aid to Ukraine? It was not his understanding that was on the cards. Well, he was wrong. And meanwhile, the Russian reaction: this is the best contribution to peace. This will push Kyiv, the regime, into the peace process. And Starmer keeps saying he won't choose between USA and Europe. And meanwhile, just in case we thought things were going to get any cheerier, Israel has decided that it's blocking entry of all humanitarian aid into Gaza.
Before you deep, because that is so important, but just on the sort of Starmer thing still. Yeah. I mean, just there is a thinking that it does look like the reason that Starmer did pretty well is that he did grovel, and it looks like what Trump has to see is he has to see the tops of people's heads, as in he needs to see people literally prostrating themselves in front of him. That's something Zelensky didn't do, but Starmer did essentially do. Not in a total I'm flat on my face grovel, but in the awkward, I know what you want and I'm just going to, reduce myself to someone that's basically handing out sweeties to a giant orange baby and keep a kind of calm sook and look like I rate you. I mean, it's when he can register the grovel happening, that kind of works. So I'd feel very sort of dubious about these he's not put a foot wrong kind of stuff, albeit you've got to say, if he's managing to kind of push forward a European front, fair play. So, one of the calls is that if France and Britain are developing a plan now that could be that the European NATO powers demand an immediate halt to all fighting. Now, again, I've heard Jen Stout talking about this, and she's so interested in all these things in a practical way, because she's pointed out that any kind of halt in fighting just lets Russia regroup, and kind of that doesn't, anything that's a ceasefire doesn't really help. But still, this would be an immediate halt to all fighting, so it hopefully is more than a ceasefire. Then launch a peace process with all interested parties without preconditions, prior concessions. If Putin balks, Britain and France must withdraw their diplomats, close borders with Russia, move to interdict its exports, mobilize their armed forces, and set a deadline for providing defensive air cover for all unoccupied Ukrainian territory. That's what one commentator on this is saying. That's where we need to get to. And that, that could be happening really very fast. So it's totally gobsmacking.
Yeah. So meanwhile, Peter Mandelson, the UK ambassador to the United States of America, said Ukraine should be the first to commit to a ceasefire and defy the Russians to follow. And I presume that is the UK government line.
Who knows? Because he came out with something that before, and everybody was basically distancing themselves from him the next day. So anyway, as you rightly went on to Israel.
I mean, yes, because it is about ceasefires as well. Because what's happened is that Israel, of course, is claiming that Hamas are endangering the ceasefire because they won't agree to an extension of the phase one, which is a halt to hostilities, release of hostages on both sides. And Steve Witkoff, remember him, folks, the guy, the Emirates, Greece, the massive real estate developer, who's Trump's ambassador, who seems to be getting in everywhere, particularly in the Middle East, has suggested a 6-week extension of phase one over Ramadan and Passover. But what's happening is Hamas have turned around and says, well, hold on a minute here. There is absolutely no commitment, despite there should have been talks taking place, to phase two, which is a permanent ceasefire, a release of all hostages, and withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And they say that the talks should have begun weeks ago. Now, but Israel is turning around and saying that, no, we want just an extension, and that there is no commitment given that if this extension is not given, that they will not go back and relaunch hostilities against the Palestinian people. So this is again Israel presenting themselves as the victims. Hamas is not accepting a ceasefire, whereas what Hamas is actually doing is going along with everything that's actually been established. It should be phase one, phase two should be initiated, but it just suggests to me, I'm looking at it, that what Israel wants is a continuation of the war, release of the hostages, the living hostages, and then they'll just go back to obliterating Gaza, and that will provide the basis for the Trump Gaza, the real estate development of the Riviera of the Middle East.
It's disgusting, actually. And it does make you wonder whether, Trump wouldn't need much emboldening because he obviously had his first run in the White House. But watching how the West has just mouthed around about Israel and watched a genocide happen without any proper organization to intervene, it's kind of like a total encouragement to Trump to think, well, I think we could probably do the same with Ukraine. And then you'd have to say probably the same with Taiwan when it comes to it, with China, Tibet, Estonia, Moldova, Panama, Greenland, you name it. Once you've lost the plot like this, you're just falling straight backwards. And I noticed another thing which was horrible. Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State, talked last month about his vision of a 21st century world dominated by the US, Russia, and China, and divided into 19th century-like geopolitical spheres of influence. So that's his kind of vision of all of this. And again, this writer from The Guardian was saying such a global catastrophe has been foretold. In his novel 1984, George Orwell describes a nightmare world divvied up between three great empires, Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia, which deliberately stoke unceasing hostility. Their shared characteristics: totalitarianism, mass surveillance, repression, immorality and gross inhumanity. It's not a cheery day, is it?
No.
But the point is, I think this is it. It's like, that is it. That is what this is. This is the motor that we're sitting against. And I know there'll be people who say, well, what can little Scotland do in this? What can little anybody do in all of this? But really, enough. And I totally think that, as I have from the start, that this was always going to happen, where all political leaders of democracies will now be stuck with the look that they're appeasing someone who their own populations really detest. And that would be true from any sampling there's been of Scots. John Swinney having any kind of meeting with Donald Trump, that to me is just a total goner. I mean, Sure, you might look like you've saved the whiskey industry or whatever. I mean, it's got nothing to do with you. Unless it is that you have looked obsequious enough to have rivaled, having a blooming bidding war with Keir Starmer and his Prince Charles envelope. That's what it's got to be. And what does that say to us about our own democracies? There's just got to be a moment where this changes. And it really should be now, with cancelling kind of aid to Ukraine. Let's hear what he comes out with tonight as well. That's enough. We've got the message. And if we want to have a different kind of set of values here, and actually they have succeeded in all sorts of measures. I'm not saying Britain has been a great archetype of it, but, those countries that have had more of a welfare state, more of a kind of, if you like, gentle democracy, more cooperation in life, all of those things have produced, longer lifestyles, greater general affluence, and less defence spending. I mean, obviously there were geopolitical reasons why many of the Nordics had decided not to be NATO members and hadn't got huge defence spending, except that they did to do peacekeeping. But that was because they were putting most of their money into having proper, a good living standard in their own countries, which we will now lose. And Britain can ill afford to do that as the most unequal country in the OECD anyway. So to me, this is like, there's no more appeasement of Trump, because it doesn't make any difference.
No, exactly. And it goes back to that point that we made earlier, that there will be an appeasing US foreign policy since the end of the Second World War. We've been going along with it, been tied to the coattails, and more than tied to the coattails when it comes to the nuclear deterrent, completely tied into it. And it is a position that, yet again, I hope an independent Scotland will not be involved in, and possibly, despite Starmer statements of the UK and the US being the closest of allies, that some realism might actually creep into the world of the new world that we're actually facing. As you say, talking about Marco Rubio there, because he just got an extra $3 billion of military aid to Israel through, without having to go through congressional review. That's the second time in 3 months that massive amounts of military aid have been granted to Israel without congressional review. Now, that was done by Joe Biden just after October the 7th. And what they've also done is that they've actually lifted the embargo on a couple of items here, one of which are the heavy bombs that Biden stopped because of their use against the civilian population in Rafah. And secondly, armored bulldozers. Armored bulldozers, which are actually Israel claims is being used to dig out Hamas terrorists, and we can actually see on our screens, if we tune into Channel 4 to see No Other Land, the Oscar-winning documentary, currently being used not just in Gaza, but on the West Bank in terms of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians to allow the illegal settlements to actually flourish. And this was, again, just about the No Other Land. I think that the armoured bulldozers got to me with this, because this movie, as I say, it is available on Channel 4. It's not been picked up by any distributors, mainstream distributors, to go in cinemas or on streaming services in the United States of America, yet still managed to win the Oscar. And if people don't know anything about it, it was filmed by Basil Adra, with a cooperation, who's Palestinian, the cooperation of Yuval Abraham, an Israeli journalist, and it documents 2019 to 23 and the Israeli destruction of Adra's hometown of Masafar Yatta. And they both gave extremely powerful speeches at the Oscars, which I did see those elements of, and they were applauded, which I think is interesting. Or am I just a weak-willed liberal, seeing flashes of light through the darkness there? But they were applauded at the Oscars, and if anybody wants to see it, it is currently being shown. You can find it on Channel 4's streaming service. Yes. So there we go. But by the way, in the BBC's coverage of the Oscars, I think they mentioned just about every winner. No mention at all of No Other Land. And of course, there's been withdrawal of the documentary after complaints about the impact of the war in Gaza because of the participation of a son. I think it was a Hamas agricultural minister's son, and it's been withdrawn because of his participation. So there you go. We won't be able to see it and won't even be talked about. Again, it's back to your Orwellian. He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the media controls the common sense and what we know and what we don't know.
And yet, I mean, the column I wrote last week, it's sort of, I look back at them and some of them think, what was that one about again? But anyway, it started off obviously with a lot of Trump stuff, but it was looking at John Swinney's announcement of this summit against far right extremism in April sometime. And I don't know, just, you can, it looks, like it sounds fine. And that's grand. I mean, it might doubtless steal an embarrassing sort of march on Scottish Labour. They'll be damned if they don't join and wrong-footed if they do. But I just wonder what good this actually does, because at the end of it, what all of this kind of right-wingery is also doing is just casting into doubt things like, for example, the purpose of renewable energy. It might look like this is in any way joined, but it totally is. Because, I mean, last week we've also seen BP announce it's going to up its oil production, it's going to cut its renewables investment. And since so much of what we're doing as a country, our strategy is actually in the hands of big kind of private companies like BP, that does put some spanners in the works of exactly where, the green transition is going. But it begins to make people think, all the stuff that they sneer at, cat ladies, kumbaya kind of spending on diversity, cycle lanes, kind of green spending when it's just simpler to get oil in again. It's all beginning to feel like a kind of, the politics that we were moving towards, which were a bit kind of grown up. If you kind of treat people with some decency, you might find that you get a better, more cooperative world, that you spend less money having to retrofit into shape. That sort of outlook, which is one that characterises Scotland and the way it's been voting for a very long time, that all looks like it's being questioned now by the sort of might is right, just slam the, you're sticking to top gear and just speed off and devil take the hindmost. So I would love to see, I mean, fair enough, you can have a summit to sort of say words about where things ought to be. But I mean, to me, we just have to reach dry land on some of these things. And all the stuff I listed there, I'm sure some people will be kind of going, yeah, cycle lanes, God almighty, Glasgow's a fucking mess with all the cycle lanes and nobody's even using them. And when it comes to green energy, people will then start having, fed in doubts about whether or not that works. Mm-hmm. And for sure, anybody who's living in an area where they've got a mega kind of wind farms all around them with a penny basically coming into the local environment and are still paying the highest kind of electricity rates in the whole of the UK, they'll be looking, you don't, it's like shooting the messenger. The messenger essentially is the turbine. People will begin to think it's the turbines that are doing this. It's almost the whole green thing has been a conspiracy to stick a whole lot of stuff, hardware into our environment and still keep stealing the money from us. And somebody needs to come in about the politics of this to say, the theft is because we are sitting with a Westminster government that has always expropriated wealth from Scotland, and our wealth is our energy, as well as our people. So as long as we're not pinpointing this and we're sort of having a kind of holding hands and saying we don't like Nigel Farage, okay, that's the symptom, really. the cause of why people are beginning to lose faith with stuff is that we're stuck between an old kind of framework of heavy industry, which we still feel emotional attachment to, and a future of a green future, which somehow doesn't have the same level of emotional attachment or belief associated with it, and unfairness abounds in it. And as long as that is allowed to happen, it will keep undermining a kind of progressive politics in Scotland. So weirdly, and I look at this and think, that was some leap you did, girl. It seems to me a really good thing to do would be to start absolutely ramping up the return to communities of cash from wind. And there was one thing I noticed, which was Mark Hull, who works for Community Energy Scotland. Lots of wind turbines are approaching their 25th birthday. That's cheerio time for lots of them. And he is talking about the possibility of replacing the old turbines with new ones, more efficient types of technology, and communities taking shared ownership of those modest-sized wind farms or taking them over completely. Right, that's more like it. And that, I would rather hear the Scottish Government come out with a plan to let every community in Scotland take over the wind farm on their patch than have a kind of holding hands against Nigel Farage event.
Yeah. Well, because that's absolutely 100%, Lesley, is that the fact is that, yes, we all object to Nigel Farage, but it forgoes the analysis of why there is an upsurge in support, as you've identified, for reform. And it is because of the fact of the failure to attack the causes of the exploitation and extraction of the wealth, not just of Scotland, but of working people right across the United Kingdom. That's the reality behind it. And it's the ability of people like Reform to point the fingers at the green agenda and migrants and others to put forward what Swinney refers to as the Russian agenda. And it isn't just a Russian agenda, it's an agenda about the exploitation of working people and the turning and othering of folk in order to gain far more power and to extract even more wealth from the labours of people and to change our society fundamentally. So yes, 100%. And not Jerry Maguire, show me the money, show me the action. And that's absolutely key to it.
I don't know if you're yeah, well, I wondered if your massive brain had then spotted a link to this sort of backtracking that looks like it's happening on
God, yeah.
Workers' rights.
Workers' rights, yeah, the New Deal for working people. Yeah, that's been an absolute, I mean, they've now got it's the right to switch off is now gone. They've already dropped the banning 0 hours contracts to focus on exploitative 0 hours contracts. They backtracked on probationary periods, which were going to be 9 months, what the trade unions were after. That's 6 months, which the trade unions were after. The probationary periods are going to be 9 months. And the latest one, the right to switch off. Now, France stopped this in 2017 and it made it illegal to be contacted by your employer out with your contracted working hours. Now, as a trade union representative, I actually was called into a situation where colleagues in another department were actually being contacted at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night about matters that were going to be taken up at work the next day and expected to look at emails, answer their phones, etc. And it was placing enormous amounts of stress. And that was part of the New Deal for working people. Sorry, the new one, Labour's plan to make work pay, is the new rebranding that has now been dropped, and that's now gone. So unlike the French, who can't be contacted out working hours, and I tried to get my head around the explanation behind it. They said it would be too much of a burden on business. We have to we'll lower business costs as much as possible. And I thought to myself, what the hell is it a burden on a business that they're able to contact people out of work? And where does it put more expenses on businesses not being able to contact people out of work? I just don't get it. I genuinely don't, and it just smells of the whole drift. Things they said to get elected on every single measure, And Angela Rayner theoretically standing up for the working class, nah. Now this is all going to go through. They will get rid of some. There will going to be some things come in there about first day entitlement to paternity leave, etc., and first day workers' rights are going to be in there. But I just wonder, it's a slow creep. Sorry, that does sound like Keir Starmer. It's a slow creep by a slow creep.
It sounds so much like they've just been lobbied the hell out of. They've had business absolutely in and about them saying, if your agenda is growth and this is the way you're going to play everything, then after the kind of national insurance rise, it's got to be everything. Every other glove has to come off. So presumably they're paying for the next rise by having to just backtrack on everything else. And I'm seeing, perhaps we've read the same article. Some government source saying growth puts money in people's pockets, and that's the number one priority of this government, which is just, okay, I didn't even need to see that, because it's like, it's the answer to absolutely everything. But then if that's true, it's the answer to everything. You have handed over your entire strategy to what business wants, if that's going to be it. And now with the kind of rearmament commitment, it's going to be to defence companies tilts, and on our energy it's going to be on BP, and on our communications it's going to be Starlink. And that's what so that's the danger of having gone down and just slightly modified a world which Margaret Thatcher privatized, which other countries did not.
Yes, I mean, it's oh God, I'm gonna move on.
Yeah,
I've got to get something cheerier, which is it's the 30th anniversary of the Scotswoman. Yay! Right. Well, tell everybody about it, Lesley, because I'm old enough to remember it, but there'll be a significant, hopefully, number of people out there who may have forgotten about it or weren't alive at the time when it happened.
Well, it's maybe not a biggie, to be really honest. It's just because somebody had asked me to do a talk to a women's group near me here in North Fife, and they said, well, talk about your time at the Scotsman. So I sort of dug out the Scotswoman, because it was a women's group, and looked at the date, and it was the 8th of March 1995. And even though I'm not very numerically blessed, I thought, this is 2025. Oh my, that's 30 years actually. So, since I've now started to try to switch to doing more stuff on films on the old YouTube channel, I went and did a talk to the gals that night, and they were all really interested to have the paper with me. And I went through all why we chose that, why, what we were trying to do with this article, how many months it took for us to get women geared up to take on the bigger editorial jobs. And one of them in particular was still probably a virtual job, but copy tasting, which was back in the old days. There was lots of paper chuntering out of machines with agency copy coming in. If it would be now, you would have to say the foreign wires would be going at their dinger the whole blooming time with Trump just. But anyway, the job for a copy taster was to keep pulling off those sheets, looking at what the news was incoming, and making a decision as to whether it then went into the backbench, into the sort of editorial side of thing to be written up or whatever, or whether it went on the spike, which was basically, nah, we're not interested. And that job there was totally pivotal to what did or didn't get into a paper. And because it tended to go on all day and all night, it was one that was quite hard for women to do because of childcare commitments. Lots of the big promoted jobs in a newspaper happen at 10 o'clock at night, like deciding what the front page is. All those things are really 10 o'clock at night things, 9 o'clock maybe. So, it took months to get women working to trial them up into some of these positions. And the budget that I had to do this was basically practically all spent on childcare, which said its own thing. There was lots of women who were totally talented and had not really been in the newsroom after 6 o'clock at night. Many who didn't have children. So, that was one thing. But anyway, we went ahead and did the paper. There was all sorts of difficulties with it, and sort of perhaps odd decisions and so on. And it worked. The paper sold out in half an hour flat, which was not really a reflection on its content, since after all, you just buy a paper. The masthead had changed for the first time in 178 years. It was a reflection on the fact that the distribution department of the Scotsman didn't like the whole thing and hadn't doubled the print run as they were requested to do. So there was a lot of kind of resistance in the paper, and yet other guys in the paper who just thought we need to flex and we need more people and different points of view in decision making. So anyway, I did a wee film with Elaine C. Smith, who does remember that edition, and I remember her response to it pretty well. So we've done a wee film working through what was chosen and why, and kind of what happened next. So if you want to see the film, it'll be launched on International Women's Day, which is this Saturday. I hate to sound like a kind of promo thing, but it's true that if you go to my YouTube channel, I think you have to subscribe. I'll get this lark sorted soon. Is it like and subscribe or something like that? But anyway, the point is, when it's posted, it'll come to you in some way that I have not yet defined.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Look forward to it. I really do. I mean, and it's good fun. And yes, this is this YouTube world. Like, subscribe, and click the
something
bell
else.
To be notified.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the thing about this, I mean, a friend had said to me, "Has anyone else did this anywhere in the world?" And I sort of, you're always reluctant to say, a world first or anything, because you think there's bound to be somebody, the Surrey Advertiser or something, or dear knows where. I did actually have a look, had a thorough kind of online search, and discovered, for example, that the Daily Mirror, interestingly enough, was launched in 1903 as a completely women-written and women-aimed-at newspaper. Wow. Because the owners back then thought there was such a huge gap in the market for advertising aimed at women. But it just had a really uncomfortable editorial line where it was a little bit kind of, knitting patterns and slightly patronizing, and then wasn't sure how it was dealing with serious political subjects. I think it just thought that was too complicated for the little gals, who at that point didn't have the vote. So it morphed within weeks into the Daily Mirror as it is proper. So it doesn't look like there's been much of an attempt to sort of do this, apart from obviously the women's sections in lots of papers that exist. It would have to be said the men's page that we had in the Scotswoman was one of the more popular parts of it. But still, I will leave you to uncover all of that on Saturday.
Right. I mean, you mentioned George Orwell. That was sort of the companion piece to 1984 was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And it comes, of course, from Miranda's quote in The Tempest, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." And Miranda said that in awe and admiration. "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." I say it with a lot less awe and admiration, considering what we've seen in the past few weeks, and in particular the past few days emanating from the United States of America. On that Shakespearean note, we'll see you next week, chums.